When Genshin Impact was undergoing development, the first playable character ever conceived was Kamisato Ayaka, followed by Jean, Aether, Lisa, and Lumine if we go by the game's unique identifiers. Being the first unit created in the game's code, Ayaka developed a reputation long before her fated release in version 2.0, as players were well aware of her existence ever since beta. As far as anyone's concerned, she not only marked our introduction to Inazuma but the introduction of Genshin as a whole. That's one thing that separates her story from that of other characters. For many of them, we discovered and grew to love them during their official reveals, either on Banner, Twitter, the character demos on YouTube, what have you. And while that was certainly just as important for her, there's probably no one else in the game who the community has a more deeply rooted love for. So it's with great pleasure that I welcome you to Why Everyone Plays Ayaka. Having been the first unit designed in the game, Ayaka was one of Genshin's playable units during the beta test. Due to this, her gameplay, abilities, attributes, and appearance were all made available to the public, or at least a general sense of how she would play out. Following the advent of version 1.0, everyone was theorizing where she would be in the meta. There was a lot of hype surrounding her eventual official debut a year later. Until then, all we could reference was what we knew of her during the beta. Fortunately, her actual gameplay was more or less identical to her beta, although personally I like the visual effect of her first elemental burst, where instead of being whirlwinds of ice, she would travel along the ground in a flurry of cuts and icicles. Anyways, players had ample time getting excited for her to eventually get into the game, and some were even saving Primo Gems for months in anticipation for it. But with hype comes expectations, and if those expectations are not met or exceeded, all of that disappointment can and will crash down on her just like it did for Zhongli, who generated so much outrage that he remains to this day the only character to have been given direct buffs to his kit. Now I don't remember if Ayaka's numbers are any different now than during beta, so maybe this entire time the players who cared enough to investigate ahead of time knew she would be very powerful, but assuming only a handful of players had this knowledge, if it even existed at all, everyone else mostly banked on the hope that she would just be good from her abilities alone. Needless to say, Ayaka passed on the character reveal department with flying colors. She was pretty, had a welcoming and amiable personality, and had plenty of front page exposure. However, her success would involve overcoming a few circumstantial roadblocks. Prior to summer of 2021, we were reeling from a steady stream of cryo units. Aside from Pyro, it was the most populated element in the game at that time, featuring 6 characters, and even early on, the units had a decent foothold in the meta in regards to function. Chongyun and Rosaria were your forced options for cryo damage, Qiqi and Diona took care of healing and supportive duties, and of course the premier 5-star DPSs, Ganyu and by technicality Eula were both extremely powerful, arguably the best of their respective weapon types. The former in particular is what led many to initially hesitate on chasing after Ayaka in her first banner. So having a comparable amount of widespread fame going by appearance, personality, and background, as well as being tied with Hu Tao as the strongest damage dealing unit from an individual standpoint, pragmatically speaking, Ganyu's existence meant that Ayaka's popularity alone would not have been enough of a push to go after her, especially for those who didn't spend money on the game and had to budget their primos. Even so, come mid-August 2021, according to the iOS sales to the Chinese market, which I know is only a fraction of the greater Genshin community, but it's substantial enough to be an accurate representation, Ayaka was the 3rd best-selling banner not counting reruns, only beaten by Klee and Venti, who were the first to feature 5-stars in the game, so their sales were naturally higher due to Genshin riding off initial hype. The player base wanted their icy Japanese waifu, and they finally got her. What's more impressive is that she pulled in these numbers even after Ganyu and Eula. One advantage early 5-stars like Xiao, Ganyu, and Hu Tao had was that players were in desperate need of a main damage dealer, a good one rather. No disrespect to Keqing, Diluc, and Child mains, but when we think of modern popular top tier DPS, the first mainstream one was Ganyu. While Ganyu was, and still is extremely powerful in her own right, her gameplay wasn't engaging to every player. At times, her persistent damage output can feel rather slow and plodding, as you'd have to wait for her to complete 2 charge cycles to get her Frostflake Arrow, and Celestial Shower isn't exactly a screen nuke that Hu Tao, Eula, Child, and most other 5-star DPSers are known for. That being said, she was broken for a 5-star that came out only a few months into the game. Not to discredit the appeal or viability of any of the early 5-stars, but in fairness, a portion of their commercial success was out of necessity to some extent. Ayaka, on the other hand, was, objectively speaking, optional. By that point, there were enough 5-stars in the game to meet the demands of the majority. It just speaks volumes to how much people loved and or wanted to pull for Ayaka before she even came out. Those who had missed her or skipped her the first time would go crazy for her during her rerun. As it stands, Ayaka's rerun is the highest grossing banner, surpassing even Shogun and Kokomi's rerun. Then again, I'm not sure how much of that was the result of her banner lasting over a month and a half though. As per usual, gameplay is what determines if a character's initial hype stays after all the waifu and husbandoism wears off. For starters, in contrast to Ganyu's evenly spread output, Ayaka's damage is more front-loaded, while also being a melee one-handed sword user much more in tune with the average action RPG enjoyer. Arguably the biggest reason why she remains one of the most widely used characters in the game is because she's everything you want and need from a cryo character. I can't think of any other units who are more in tune with their element than Ayaka. Cryo is all about maintaining and creating lasting pressure by way of its premier reaction, freeze. The idea is to apply cryo and hydro as frequently as possible so as to keep your target stuck in place. Fittingly, most cryo units have either their skill or burst to facilitate continuous application, whether it deals a lot of damage or not. And Ayaka is no exception to this, possessing an elemental burst that not only attacks 20 times in 5 seconds, but deals upwards of 4000% in those 5 seconds to all enemies caught in the blizzard. In the past, one-shot kills like Huta's Spirit Soother are preferred over multi-hitters because of internal cooldown. To prevent certain attacks from being ridiculously broken, elemental applications can only take place once every 2.5 seconds or once every 3 hits from that specific attack, whichever comes first. Otherwise, multi-hitters would be insanely overpowered. Imagine getting Swirl off every single tick of Venti's Tornado. Now the freeze reaction technically follows the same internal cooldown protocol, but in most cases, the duration of a single freeze lasts long enough to exceed either 2.5 seconds or the time it takes to deal 3 more cryo hits. The numbers escape me right now, just search up Gauge Unit Theory on the wiki, but TLDR, prior to Quicken, freeze was an elemental reaction where the longer a cryo attack is or the more hits it deals, the better. Why this matters for Ayaka's burst is that it means so long as you can apply hydro consistently, and that's very easy to do thanks to Shinto, Kokomi, or Yelan, she can effectively guarantee all of that damage. It's just internally built into her kit. You don't need any external support beyond applying one of the easiest elements to apply in the game. Moreover, Ayaka has a multitude of ways to dish out cryo beyond just her ultimate. The one in particular that solidifies her consistency is her ability to infuse herself with cryo infinitely through her alternate sprint. For the price of a measly bit of stamina, Ayaka's auto attacks deal cryo damage, while other units' infusions are attached to a buff or some condition. Ayaka is able to freely infuse herself at any point in time so long as you can dash. Essentially, she has zero downtime, thus conducive to lasting pressure. Not only that, but the dash itself applies cryo. She's just a walking cryo application, who also has incredible base damage and quite frankly overtuned numbers. Understanding that cryo doesn't have that many ways to amplify their DPS through external means, or not to the same extent anyway, Ayaka was granted a bit more leeway in personal damage output. The nature of cryo's long-lasting periodic effects makes it difficult to condense all your power into one or a few hits, and that limits the potential of using cryo melt, alongside only getting 1.5 times bonus out of it instead of pyro's melt being 2 times. The other 2 reactions, superconduct and freeze, don't improve your damage by that much or at all for the latter. Mind you, freezing opponents in place is in and of itself a DPS increase as you don't have to waste time trying to keep them all together and whatnot. But my point is, cryo units are for the most part self-reliant. At first glance, it may seem ridiculous for Ayaka to have such generous numbers, more than even Ganyu, who's no slouch either in terms of her Frost-like arrows. At rank 10, Ayaka's Hyoka deals 430% base damage and generates a ton of particles. One of her passive talents increases her base attack damage by 30%, and if you have Constellation 1, that temporary buff can theoretically last forever. Speaking of her constellations, I'm not implying everyone has access to them, but they're quite insane. Frankly speaking, these are what constellations should be in my opinion. Drastic increases in power to merit the cost to obtain them, as you essentially have to pull for a second copy, which can cost hundreds of dollars. You can argue that C1's not anything special, but C2 is where things really start to come online. When casting her elemental burst, 2 more blizzards will follow the main one, doing 20% of the original's damage. Now since the other 2 blizzards diverge in a cone-like fashion, it's difficult to get all 3 to stay on the same target, especially if it's a small enemy. But the blizzards halt their advance when hitting something. Against big enemies, like, I don't know, H-Daha, landing a triple burst is an easy task. And for enemies you can freeze, you can be assured at least the first 2 seconds of hits will connect. Essentially, Ayaka C2 is an unconditional 40% increase in damage on her elemental burst, capping out at just under 6000% base at rank 10. For reference, Huta's Spirit Soother caps out at around 620. Granted, she'll likely have way more base attack and the added benefit of Vaporize, but it puts into perspective just how overinflated Ayaka's numbers are. Most people don't go beyond C2 since by that point it's just no longer worth the cost, but Constellation 4 offers a 30% defense break to anyone struck by a burst as well. She just tears everything to pieces with a single ultimate. Other powerful attack bursts like Eula, Shogun, Child, Hutao even, all require initial setup or support of some kind. Not counting reactions, Eula needs characters who can amplify her attack speed in order to amp up her finishing attack as much as possible. Shogun needs the rest of her team to cast her elemental burst first to make her stronger. Basically, some preliminary condition needs to be met. Granted, we can apply the same clause to Ayaka regarding freeze, but going off of just damage output, Ayaka is very self-sufficient. That's not to say she doesn't benefit from external support, but she's not tethered to a specific team composition or playstyle. That's really what it boils down to. Ayaka is a melee fighter, and historically Genshin has been sort of biased towards melees, more specifically sword and polearm users. She has a near endless amount of cryo damage in application, making her extremely consistent when running a freeze comp, and freeze is one of the easiest teams to construct. She does so much damage at base thanks to her overtuned baseline, and the way she dishes out damage is very fluid and unintrusive to your party's momentum, in that she doesn't demand that much field time if you don't want her to. That's how things are for her internally, but there's external circumstances that played in her favor too, just like how they did for Kokomi. Earlier 5-stars had the advantage of being first in line, but that also meant the number of options weren't as plentiful. This initially wasn't a problem, players were still more or less playing whoever they felt like playing, and the notion of a jack of all trades, master of none wasn't acknowledged until far later. Fast forward to version 2.0 and we started to get more units who took care of a certain niche. For example, Kujosada specializes in electro support, Shunho specializes in cryo support, Goro is geo support, Yunjin increases normal attack speed, so on and so forth. Generalists like Bene, Ganyu, and Kazuha still remain vitally useful, but we're seeing a gradual shift towards a specific type of party now that there's plenty of characters to sort through. That means in any scenario where cryo damage and or freeze is called into question, Ayaka is indisputably the best choice. She does way more damage than any other cryo unit at the current moment, therefore any cryo support would be most optimal on her. Just to reiterate, Ganyu is still fantastic in her own right and offers more versatility thanks to her decoy and long range, but her DPS is a lower ceiling than Ayaka. If the goal is pure cryo damage, Ayaka is currently the best. Something else that works in her favor is the element she belongs to. Humorously, Ayaka's attendant, Toma, has a very interesting moveset and playstyle, but its usefulness is hamstrung by the fact that he's a pyro character. Were he any other element, like Hydro or Cryo, he might have found more success. As you know, there's an artifact set corresponding to each element in the game. Blizzard Strayer for Cryo, Viridis Inventor for Animo, Thundering Fury for Electro, Crimson Witch for Pyro, Archaic Petra for Geo, Heart of Depths for Hydro, and Deepwood Memories for Dendro. Some of them have 2 elemental related sets, but I'm mostly referring to the ones that give 15% bonus damage for that element. Anyways, it's common knowledge that Viridis Inventor is the most overpowered elemental artifact set in the game for how perfectly it synergizes with what Animo units often aim for. In my opinion, Blizzard Strayer is the second best. The 4-piece set bonus can increase your crit rate by 40%, 20% from attacking something affected by cryo, to which Ayaka can do just by sprinting towards them, and another 20% against frozen targets, to which once again Ayaka can achieve with relative ease. Additionally, when Cryo's Elemental Resonance is in play, you get an extra 15% crit rate against enemies who are either frozen or affected by Cryo, giving you a grand total of 55% bonus crit rate for free basically. This allows Ayaka to spec almost all of her stats into crit damage, in tandem with her Ascension stat being crit damage, and Mist Splitter also being crit damage, and it's very easy to get 100 crit, 250% crit damage on her, augmenting her base damage even further. This is what I meant when I said Ayaka is the ideal embodiment of the Cryo element itself. She's extremely consistent at achieving freeze, Cryo's best reaction. She has so much base damage to account for Cryo not providing that many ways to amp your numbers the way Pyro does for instance. Her ultimate is a persistent effect, so she can use it then swap out, by the way it does snapshot and deals insane damage. Cryo Resonance and Blizzard Strayer give her the freedom to max out her crit damage for even bigger strength. Ayaka is exactly what you need from a Cryo unit. I can't in good conscience say she's better than Ganyu overall though. The two have their own functions and purposes even down to their weapon type. There are times when you need Ganyu's utility and others when you need Ayaka's raw force. But that's probably why they've been able to coexist so well. Ganyu's flexibility allows her to either be a main damage dealer or sub DPS. Ayaka is strictly for main damage. That means you can use both on the same team. Would she have been as popular if she wasn't so overpowered? Definitely not. It's true that she has a very loyal following, but no one can deny that strength plays a huge role in where a character stands, and I think MiHoYo knows this. Is it power creep? Somewhat. If another main cryo DPS were to be released in the future who does more damage than her, Ayaka's usability will be contested. But I don't think that's gonna happen for a while. She is MiHoYo's favorite character after all. Don't take my word for it, they love her so much they released a full-length animated video for her rerun. Anyways, if you guys enjoyed the video, I'd appreciate it if you could leave a like and subscribe. Consider following me on Twitter @Vars, joining my Discord server, and if you'd like to support me further, check out my Patreon. By donating, you get access to benefits for all 3 of my channels, Vars, Vars2, and Vars3. But till next time, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.